Welcome to the Hiki-Goma Podcast. I'm Elliot. This is a podcast documenting my ongoing experiences making manga from the writing stage to the producing stage, working with artists, and finally publishing. I can say happily, finally I can release a manga I've been talking about for a while. It's called Reach. You can find it in the link below. I don't want to stay on this too long in terms of me shilling this or anything. It's completely free. You can read it for free. People who've subscribed to my email list will have already received this by the time this video is out. So if you want to get my stuff directly, then you can just go there. I'll talk about my experiences with that later, but first I want to continue talking about what I've been talking about for the past 2 episodes, which is basically my initial experiences with the research phase of writing. I'm going to be going through basically my history with manga so far, just a general overview currently of my thoughts on the various stages before I end up just talking more concurrently about what I'm doing. In saying that, in previous episodes, I've distinctly separated the older, here's my thoughts on this stuff in the past, and here's my current stuff. This is going to blend a little bit more today because, funnily enough, there's all these just strange echoes happen. Experiences you've had previously, experiences you're having currently, they're all kind of combining a little bit. So I want to continue talking about this idea, this theme I'm probably going to keep on just like hammering in over and over again in all these different manners, which is basically what your planning is, what your initial intention is, versus what the reality ends up being. And I recall, I think, either in the previous episode or the episode prior, I think I mentioned something along the lines of, I don't know how badly I screwed up my research because I'm only just starting to make this project. I know I screwed it up in some ways because I had to, write a full screenplay, and I knew that, okay, well, some character stuff still isn't working, I knew that there was a big difference between what I required to write the script and what I actually had planned. But now that I'm starting to actually produce it, I'm starting to, art is coming back to me, and I'm having to, convey to an artist, okay, well, this is what, the intention of this scene is, this is what this person wants, this is what I'm going for, in terms of mood and aesthetic and so on, then it gets even more and more critical. Like, you really have to know at, the further and further stages, the more and more realize it is, you really have to know what your intention is. You can't be really split on anything. And if you are split, then that split is just going to be cemented, it's going to be fossilized into the work. To make this example concrete, I have a character, and I guess I was going back through my notes because, I had to do some character designs for this person. I was having to explain, I wanted to explain to the artist just the general relations between the characters, just to, so that they had a, better grasp of what was going on. And I realized, I had about maybe, 50 or 60 pages of notes on this character. A lot of these are dot points, a lot of them are just ideas, like, oh, what if it was, if he did this, or what if he had this backstory, or what if, this event happened in the future, or what if, he looked like this, or what if, all sorts of notes, anything you can think of to do with character and with story and with, yada. And, a lot of that's fine, but the problem is, again, a lot of it exists at this low level. It exists at this level of almost this casual spitballing. It's almost what I'd associate with like middle management, kind of bureaucratic, these meetings, you hear about that just go nowhere. People who have meetings for hours and hours and hours and hours and just nothing's decided on. That's what this is the like writing equivalent of. It's what if, and then nothing's decided. So instead, everything is almost equally up for grabs, and you end up having a completely amorphous person. So basically I looked at all these character notes, and they're all this low level where it's all these what if this, what if this, what if this, and nothing had been decided on. I had just, I guess every time I'd gone back to try and figure out, okay, what is this guy's motivation? What's his motivation? Why does he do what he's doing? Not decided on, barely even discussed, because I was so stuck in this, mirage of just like, oh, what if he's this? What if he's this? What if he's this? Long story short is that, this guy, turns out, didn't actually have a motivation. And I actually wasn't able to realize that until I, was in this process of actually literally doing the pages, having this character on screen per se, that I was able to go, oh yeah, shit. I actually wrote an entire screenplay not only did I take notes on this guy, I actually wrote a whole screenplay where I realized that I could not verbalize what this guy's motivation was. Not only could I not verbalize, I couldn't think of it at all. It's not as if it was so complicated it was impossible to put into words. It just could not be verbalized in a concrete manner, because it was 100 different things. It was, oh, he wants it for this, maybe he wants it for this, maybe he wants it for this. A total indecisiveness, basically. Now again, this is all just stuff from my experience, so hopefully you're the same kind of person, I guess, who has this kind of experience. What it is, I believe, not to psychoanalyze too hard, but it is a kind of avoidance, right? And the process of coming up with, hundreds and hundreds of ideas, it's kind of this, poisoned fruit in a way, where it appears to be this wonderful thing, and you're going, wow, I'm being so creative, I'm coming up with so much material, I've got lots of good stuff in here. But the problem is that you might have 100 good ideas, but unfortunately, a lot of the time, lots of those ideas cannot be shared. If you want a character to have a tragic backstory, and then you also want them to not have a tragic backstory, then you can't, reconcile those two things. So in that case, you're actually just basically creating like disappointment for yourself, because you're just going to have all of these lost futures where you're going, oh no, he could have been like this, it could have been like this, it could have been like this. I haven't really made my mind up on this, but this is kind of the way that I see, I think it's kind of like a fundamental conflict in terms of writing and planning. On the one hand, it's basically the conflict between people who are, architects who plan stuff extensively, outline, and people who are pantsers who just, write whatever they want, they go with the flow, and then they kind of fix it later in the, first draft, second draft, that kind of thing. It's this conflict between what I was intending to do, which I think was wrong, and kind of on the extreme end of planning, which is have everything be 100% certain before you start, which, as I've probably been repeating myself a lot, really doesn't work, because you need to, actually be able to see how things work in a real tested experience, and things are always going to be typically wildly different to what you expected. Your intention versus what actually comes out on the page, very hard to convey. And that reminds me, I should talk in a second about Reach, this manga that I just released that you can read for free, as I said before. But on the other hand, it is really difficult, because at the same time, it's a pretty bold decision to say, I'm going to go into production almost, and I'm going to have to discover things along the way, sometimes things that are pretty fundamental. But it's kind of weird, because in my experience so far, the way that I judge some level of success is, for one, I haven't died in real life. I haven't died. So that's good. I'm not, starving to death. I have most of my faculties, And then the second thing is that it is going okay. I haven't, hit a point where I feel like I've completely, ruined my story somehow because I've done this. It's entirely a matter of personal suffering and inefficiency. And those are really big concerns, but, compared to, death and complete, total catastrophe of your story, a lot of the time it's required really finicky mental gymnastics to figure out, oh God, I really did not consider, wait a minute, how is that character there at that time? Or why would they have this motivation if, they're actually related to this person? Why would they, wouldn't they have this? And would, and sometimes having to, create entire complicated scaffolding to basically explain away certain things. But in saying that, the irony is that some of that scaffolding, those almost those quick fixes you need to make to, patch something up to make sure that a character, it makes sense as to why a character can't go somewhere at some time, or why they would have a particular motivation, even though it might not initially make sense. Those kinds of complexities are some of the most interesting ones. However, I do accept a certain degree to which you can't just completely have no idea what you're doing and try to shove a bunch of things together, especially in something that's a bit more complicated, that involves, a long timeline, a long history, some lore, metaphysics even, and, a long plot with many characters. I do accept that, that's obviously going to take, you're just going to need to plan more because you're just going to have to think, okay, well, I have 50 characters. I'm going to have to know who those people are and how they are interacting to some, degree or whatever. But I guess a critical point is that, again, and I feel like I'm just reiterating myself, but this is just such a strong experience that just keeps on being, every time I look at these notes, I'm being hit over the head with it. It's a powerful lesson being smacked in the head with a hammer daily. The psychological equivalent is that I would have these notes, and I'm just going to read some of these. And again, I'm all for this stuff being really embarrassing because it's fun. To me, it's kind of basically funny now. But of course, this is like horribly embarrassing because it's like so... it's so clearly not going to be useful. And it's so clearly this kind of like... A lot of this planning that I've done for these characters is very on what I'd call like the ethical realm and the thematic realm. Those are perfectly good places to inhabit. Those are things you really should think about. And one of the things that I guess tricked me, I thought that I had to start basically with like a worldview. I have to have, okay, this idea about how all this stuff is going to work, right? But I have to have some idea of, okay, here's what the like ethical like message is, or here's like exactly what the theme is. And if I was thinking about it in the way of, you might have the most, granular, real thing is something like dialogue or moment by moment actions. A character picks up an object, they, move here, they look here, they do. Those are the most granular, the most real. And then you're kind of going up into the more and more abstract. You have characters physically, and they're talking, and they're doing motions, and there's plot, and then there's character in the sense of, personality, and then motivation, and, then you have the relations between characters, right? That's a more complicated, abstract thing. Okay, now you can kind of start to see groups forming certain ideologies, right? Ideologies from those groups, and then you start to have a broader theme kind of emerges as the collective whole of all of those components. You see a sort of a way of life or a snippet into life being demonstrated, or the narrative is perhaps saying something about whatever, it's commenting on a certain issue, or it's doing that through some kind of conflict between characters with conflicting ethics or ideologies or life philosophies or whatever. And so I think I made this error, and it's actually kind of it's hard to conceptualize this, so hopefully this makes sense, because I haven't really thought of this in this way before. But this idea that, I guess, theme is almost this separate thing that emerges from the collective whole of material things in the story. It emerges from the actions the characters take and the relations between characters and who these people are and the things that they choose to do. It's not exactly something that you can see. It's almost it's a vapor, or it's a kind of, it's like a kind of gravity. It's a thing that's kind of holding. It's kind of the force a little bit. And so, unfortunately, I was kind of existing in this sort of vapor realm of thinking, okay, well, maybe this person should be like this kind of ideology, and it's kind of like this, and it's kind of like this. And it ends up being, the initial stages, I had to kind of, even in my notes, I was like, Jesus, this is extreme, like my note-taking period. Because that method kind of ended up being closer almost to like, I don't know too much about these, but almost these like medieval, like moral tales. I think when people say moral tale, or moral story, that is actually referring like initially to a specific thing, which is these like, medieval like Christian, almost fairy tale kind of things. And the structure is basically Christian character, or a character with Christian attributes, basically goes from place to place and talks from person to person. And basically each different place, each different person represents a different opponent of Christianity, or a different, ideology that opposes Christianity or whatever. And that, the Christian figure basically destroys each ideology as they go along, and the whole thing is basically proving Christianity is the best thing ever, I ended up having something that was similarly structured to that, where I'm thinking, okay, what's my personal philosophy? And then I need to have each different character represent different philosophies, and then that's the whole point of a story, apparently, is that it's all just an ideological war, as opposed to something that emerges half naturally, half from human construction. I think I'm going to leave a full discussion of theme to a later date, because it's a topic I feel I don't want to say well understood because I feel like I still don't understand it. It's a topic that gets more complicated and murky and kind of bizarre, I guess, almost the more that I write stuff. But I think that almost needs like a full treatment. Long story short is just to really emphasize one of the problems I was having, and this is most likely something that other people have also done, is have these extremely, not only are they these notes that are not being tested in the real world, then you're writing things, oh, this character's going to be like this, he's going to be like this, he's going to be like this, and you're not actually writing a script, or you're not starting to draw pages, or you're not starting to write dialogue, so you don't truly know what they're going to be like. But not only that, like that's, a certain level of, it has a certain level of risk, let's say. It's not bad, it just has a risk to it, and you have to know, how to manage that risk, basically. But at least those things, like, oh, I want him to look like this, and I want him to, maybe he's going to be a rambunctious, da-da-da-da-da. Those are at least attributes. But what I was talking about were these things that were almost completely removed from desire, completely removed from humanity even. It was just like, for instance, I'd be like, I want someone who's a utilitarian, and they're gonna, have this kind of ideology because of this response to the world, and they see that the world is like this, my particular world that I've created, and they're gonna see it's like this, and they're going to, da-da-da-da, they're gonna like this, and they're gonna dislike this, and they might want this, but it ends up being like anyone could have that. It ends up being like so divorced from reality that when you go to write it, you're like, I'm writing an ideology, not a character. I'm writing an ideology, and ideologies don't have feelings, and they can't do things, Okay, so just for instance, if I were to read just a random excerpt from character X is what I'll call them. I just don't want to, spoil things, although hopefully this doesn't really spoil anything. In the sophists I see, alongside MacIntyre, Alistair MacIntyre, a relativism around the ethics of the Homeric man. There is a kind of sliding in regards to what certain terminology means, and as a result, a kind of rat race to see who can redefine reality for everyone else. When there is a loss of the understanding of what words mean, then you can really do anything with the language. That is fundamentally what sophistry was a realization of. Okay, so again, that's just basically research. And then I end that by saying, I really like the idea that character X is a reflection of that, and I think it perfectly symbolizes what is going on in Aegis at the time. And so, again, that almost might not sound super bad, but at the time I wrote that, and also, well, actually, most of my notes sound like that. And there aren't things like, oh, this guy wants this thing. It's like, no, this guy is a philosophical representation of this very specific research I read. Now, it's not as if that is inherently bad. It's just bad if that's the only thing you have. If all your notes read something along the lines of that. And it comes down to something that I feel like maybe I haven't emphasized enough with research, is it's a kind of like you are what you eat sort of situation. I basically purely consumed philosophy, effectively. I already had a pretty decent understanding of the history that I was kind of riffing on, and, not perfectly by any means, but that stuff, but the kind of plot-related stuff, the kind of time period stuff, that's all very, very concrete, and so I was never really worried about that. But a lot of what I concerned myself with was basically just philosophy, and also a lot of cultural analysis stuff of the time period. And so I was purely consuming this really esoteric stuff. And funnily enough, around the time period, I actually wasn't like consuming much normal media. I wasn't really watching many films. I wasn't really reading many comics, watching TV shows. I was pretty just focused on this and, really fucking tired from reading this like really difficult abstract stuff that I would just totally conk out and just, watch crap on YouTube. So the thing was, I was getting purely, really, high-end abstract stuff, very interesting in itself, incredible material, not shitting on the material, but I was only getting that super abstract stuff, and then I was consuming no stories, basically. Terrible, terrible combo if it's done in that manner. Eventually, I felt like I had kind of enough of a grounding in the philosophy stuff I wanted, plus it was coupled with, for instance, I started writing the script. And then I realized, oh shit, I'm writing something, for instance, that prominently features, I don't know how to get around explaining this because it's kind of a spoiler, but it basically featured a very particular kind of film genre. And then I went, oh shit, I should just watch like 50 of genre X. And I just watched a bunch of this particular kind of film, let's just say, and then that was way more fucking useful than most of the research I'd ever done because it actually contributed like, oh, that's what they did here, or that's an interesting take on that thing, or maybe I could do something similar. And it wasn't stuff that was so abstract. Now, in saying that, that philosophy has really influenced not only like my life, I guess, but I don't want to just have taken these gifts from that stuff that I read and then just completely shun it. Long story short, I'm not like knocking philosophy at all, and I think in a future episode I'll have to talk about, the fact that I really recommend that people do read this stuff because it gives you, a much more grounded understanding of ethics and these things that people just seem to not, understand, or they really just take for granted. But sort of closing this out, I want to talk about basically just very briefly my experiences working on this manga that I've now released called Reach. Unfortunately, I didn't win anything in this competition. I did, honestly, to just be completely frank, I did sort of expect I would at least get one of the lower kind of level things, even just like, getting through a first pass or a second pass, but unfortunately not. I'm not gonna lie, I am slightly depressed by that. One of the problems I've had prior to this that kind of makes that a little bit of a harder hit to take than I anticipated it being is I really had this problem of my stuff being not only validated in a real world thing, going from concept to page to art, but also just being validated, by an audience. I'm pretty used to just in previous projects I've done, in just previous like YouTube projects I've done. I guess if anyone doesn't know, I have a film review YouTube channel. You can check that out, I guess, again, in my like link tree. With those projects, you work on them for, maybe months sometimes, what I did, and then you release them and you just get comments and you get feedback and you get all sorts of things. But there's been such a deficit between action and release. Kind of, again, I get these kind of weird parallel mirrors between the past and the present, where even though I feel like I've largely overcome some of that really ridiculous note taking where, I'm just writing this pure theme stuff, I still end up having this gap between intention and what is actually read on the page. But basically, I think I understand why it wasn't picked, and there are legitimate flaws in it. So first of all, the manga has no dialogue. It's called a silent manga. It's for a competition, particularly for manga with no dialogue. So in my defense, that is a little bit tricky. However, obviously the whole point is that that's really useful having those kinds of restrictions because they really force you to be clear and concise. And now I just got a test result that basically to me shows, wow, this is actually much clearer than some of your previous stuff, but it's like still like it's just in that like uncanny valley basically where it's just doesn't really work, or like maybe only like 50% of people would kind of get what I was going for. And when I say get what I was going for, I don't mean like in an intellectual way. I actually just mean in like an emotional messaging way. So just to describe like the inciting event, we see a girl, she's in the doorway of a bedroom, and what look like her parents are in a bed and they're holding a baby, like a newborn. And so she begins to tear up and she kind of looks a bit afraid. The baby is reaching out to her, she looks a little afraid, and then she runs off into the woods. Other things happen in the story after that, but that initial inciting event, what I realized afterwards and in production is if you hear that description that I'm describing, obviously it's not going to be as, evocative as the images you're seeing, but the particular intention I was going for is something that when I describe it, it becomes very clear to me that it's too complex or too specific of an emotion that is really possible without dialogue. It would need more establishment. It would need to be clearer in some way. I obviously can't think off the top of my head how I would do this. And I kind of want to leave this in because I'm sort of struggling to really describe what I was even going for. Again, kind of a problem, isn't it? I think I was almost going for like a a fear of the unknown or a fear of the like future with a new sibling, that kind of thing. But when I say that, that's like I'm almost thinking of like, oh yes, this is a fear of otherness. Right. But even me, like rereading this, if I had my memories wiped and I read this, I don't think I would get what I was actually going for. Because no one is reading that kind of intention. They're not going, yes, the girl is dealing with otherness. They're not going to be, actually pulling that from it. They're going to go, what? Reasonably, right? This is the reasonable thing to take away from this. They're going to go, okay, the girl is scared of the baby? She has a phobia of babies? Is that what's happening? Like, it's not really going to make sense emotionally. And, that's a pretty big problem, especially because the story itself is sort of a fairy tale. It's not exactly, super grounded in reality. And so effectively, that's the premise, basically, right? And that ends up being a fairly abstract thematic thing where it's meant to sort of be a story of this girl overcoming this fear of otherness, but the I can go into this probably in a later date. The metaphor definitely gets mixed a little bit. Looking at other entries to that competition, which, to be fair, I did previously. I did look at other entries. They're much simpler than mine. I pulled it down. It used to be a previous I wrote a couple of scripts and kind of picked like the best one, I guess. And those other ones were much more complicated and a lot less clear, and would have, just thinking about them, they would have been much harder to convey, would have made even less sense. But I probably pulled it down to it's much simpler, but it's not still like simple enough. So let me know what you think of that, because in saying that, I'm still happy with so much of that. It was a great experiment, even though I'm like slightly like, damn, I didn't win. I kind of thought it was still, maybe good enough to have some kind of recognition. For me, that was really just a great experiment because it was my first time kind of really successfully working with an artist. Good or bad, it is like my vision, basically, plus the artist's fantastic work. I can't really emphasize enough how happy I am with the art. I think it's wonderful. I think the artist Mirai Rena did a fantastic job with it. You can find their socials down below. I would really recommend checking them out. Yeah, they really went above and beyond. Like, I can't talk about the art is not the problem. It's funny though, because obviously I could take this as some horrible loss because I go, oh no, my story, it doesn't make any sense or whatever. But in reality as well, it's like, oh, I was able to like successfully, all of the, action makes sense. It all visually makes sense, right? It's just this part emotionally. It's critical, right? I'm not trying to like, minimize that. It's a really critical aspect that the emotional core of the story, probably most people aren't. It's not really making sense, fair enough. But all these other things are working. They could have all fucked up. They could have been horrible. So, it's a case where it's like I've had, probably like 10 steps forward, almost one step back. Again, that one step is fairly critical, but it's like, okay, now the stuff I'm working on in the future, that just really hones me in when I'm like working on Aegis, right? You get this like, I think it almost really helps having these multiple projects going, right? Because, again, I finished that Silent Manga one, maybe three months ago or something. And so obviously it's now a case where I'm continuing to work on Aegis. And if I'm getting this feedback when I, reread this thing 3 months later, when I start to get other people's feedback on it, and I go, oh shit, yeah, I still 3 months ago had a problem with real clarity. Maybe I should really make sure, like let's really focus in on Aegis, make sure that doesn't have that. And that's the great thing, right? Is because I don't win a competition. Not many people probably end up knowing about the manga, but then it helps me fix a thing I do actually want to really, push, shill to people or whatever. Probably end up just talking more and more about Reach a little bit more in detail later. This is just a bit all over the place as usual. I feel like I ended up covering a lot of topics that kind of need their own entire podcast dedicated to them. So I'm sure I'll talk about all those things in greater detail later. I'll probably end up talking about Reach in a bit more detail just at a later date. Just like my experiences working with the artist, what I think worked, what didn't work. So a lot of this stuff, as fast as it is, will be covered at a later date. You can check out all my socials in the links below. Again, you can read that manga for free, either through my email list, which I'd recommend going to because you're just going to get whatever I release if you're interested in that, and you don't have to accidentally miss it on social media or whatever, which I know always happens to me when I'm trying to follow people. I love email lists for that reason. And I have all my other socials, whatever. It's my link tree or whatever down below. Thanks for listening/watching. Goodbye.